Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our live webinar, Hot Topics in IO Psychology. I'm Dr. Carl Persing, Director of Industrial Organizational Psychology Program at Marywood University, and I'll be the facilitator for the presentation today. This webinar was created by the Student Academia Subcommittee of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, SIOP, to increase the awareness and understanding of industrial organizational psychology among students in psychology and in business. The purpose of this webinar is to enhance the breadth of knowledge provided by our previous webinars by providing information on topics that are of great interest within the field of IL at the present time. Participants should feel free to view our previous webinars that are archived on the SIOP website. This webinar will be archived as well at a later date. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a text chat window. There's a large window that holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you'll type in your questions. To send a question, click in the text box and type. When you're finished, click the send button. All the questions that you submit are seen only by today's presenters. They're not archived. Your questions will be responded to in the order in which they're received and according to time constraints and their relevance. Questions will be addressed as time permits near the end of the presentation. At the conclusion of today's program, we ask that you complete a brief post-event survey. Please take a moment to complete that survey as it will help SIOP plan future web events. We're joined today by my co-members of the Academic Subcommittee of the Visibility Committee of SIOP, Ryan Johnson, a doctoral student at the University of South Florida, Dr. Mark Rose, an IO psychologist who works for the United States Air Force, Dr. Matt Millard, an IO psychologist who works for Pepsi Company, Sarah Brothers, a doctoral student from the University of Houston, and Katie Gerson, a workforce measurement consultant at Allstate Insurance. My co-moderators today for this webinar are Matt and Sarah, and the other members are helping behind the scenes. Our panelists today include IO psychologists who work in academics and industry, and we will introduce them very soon. At this time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Sarah, who will introduce herself and provide a brief introduction to the field of IO psychology.
Thank you, Carl. Hi, my name is Sarah, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Houston. IO psychology is an area of specialization within psychology that involves the application of methods, facts, and principles of psychology to understanding behavior in the workplace. The subfield of psychology studies factors that affect the way people act and interact in the workplace and in organizations. IO psychology has traditionally been divided into two parts: industrial psychology, which is associated with the employee recruitment, selection, training, performance assessment, and job analysis and competency modeling, and organizational psychology, which is associated with worker motivation, work attitudes, leadership development, executive coaching, organizational development, occupational health, wellness, and safety. These are some of the main areas of IO psychology, and they include employees, which we study some testing, selection and promotion, employee motivation, organizational development, which includes survey design, job design, team building, workforce planning. We, of course, contribute to research in data analysis and statistics, statistical modeling, and data privacy and confidentiality and ethics issues. And, of course, human resource management, in which we contribute some legal, workplace health, and employee behavior research. I will now turn the microphone over to Matt, who will introduce himself and talk about employment opportunities within IO, SIOP, and previous webinars produced by SIOP.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. This is Matt Millard. I'm an IO psychologist at PepsiCo, and happy to talk to you a little bit about how we a little bit more about SIOP in terms of job placement and opportunities. Question that's often asked is, can I get an IO job? The answer is very simply, you bet. There are many opportunities for IO psychologists. It's very low unemployment in the field, and it's actually the highest paying area within psychology, which is great news for all of us. The opportunities for bachelor level graduates are plenty. in terms of being in human resources management, research, sales, marketing, training, and other fields. And the pay is going to be similar or higher to business graduates. Now, when you speak about those with graduate degrees, the average salary is around $70,000 a year for master's level graduates and over $100,000 for PhD level graduates. So what kind of titles do those in the industry typically have? You may be a staff member, a manager, or a director, or even a vice president of many different functions and organizations, including personnel and human resources being one of the most common, or organizational planning and development, personnel research, some others such as training, affirmative action, talent management, etc. Or you may go into the academic field and be a professor in a psychology department and a management department. Organizational behavior and industrial relations are also very common. And in terms of industries that IO psychologists work in, private industry employs many people that are IO psychologists, and such as finance or banking, manufacturing, utilities and retail, and many other industries. Also for government, many IO psychologists work in the government for government, for unions and trade organizations as well, and also research and development and education fields. Now, a little bit about SIOP. SIOP is a Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. It's a division of the APA, affiliated with the APS, and the mission is to enhance human well-being and performance in organizational and work settings by promoting the science, practice, and teaching of industrial and organizational psychology. Now, memberships are offered to both students and professionals that are within the discipline, and you can find out actually more information about SIOP by going to SIOP.org and clicking on the students section. Like this webinar, we actually have several other pre-recorded webinars that you'll find on SIOP.org, which we strongly recommend that you go and listen to. Again, they're similar to this in that we have panelists from the field that take questions around the discipline. One is graduate school and careers in psychology. This one is really focused on what's the admission process like to get into graduate school, and what are some things that you'll do while you're at graduate school. So you want to become an IO psychologist is a webinar that focuses on more of what is the field of IO psychology like, and what are some of the jobs and titles like, and then also a day in the life of an IO psychologist is the actual day-to-day in the workplace, the types of things that you'll do there. So again, these are on the SIOP website. The address is listed here below. And an archived version of today's webinar will be posted soon on SIOP.org, so you can go there and find more information about that. So I'm now going to turn the microphone back over to Sarah, who will introduce the panelists for today.
We are very lucky to have such a distinguished set of panelists for this webinar. First, I'm going to introduce Dr. Lillian Eby. Dr. Eby is a professor of psychology at the University of Georgia, a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Research, and the Institute for Behavioral Research at the University of Georgia. She's currently the principal investigator on 3 concurrently running grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to study workforce development issues in substance abuse treatment organizations. Dr. Eby's research focuses on organizational careers and occupational health psychology. Specifically, she studies positive and negative aspects of mentoring relationships, factors that predict individual career success, worker well-being, and the intersection of work and family life. She has published or presented over 200 peer-reviewed papers. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. E. Kevin Kellaway. He is the Canada Research Chair in Occupational Health Psychology at St. Mary's University, Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Director of the CN Center for Occupational Health and Safety, and a Fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Canadian Psychological Association. He also maintains an active practice consulting to private and public sector organizations on issues related to leadership, performance management, and measurement of employee attitude and performance. Dr. Kellaway's research interests include occupational health psychology, leadership, the development and measurement of work attitudes and values, unionization, and the management of knowledge workers. Next, we have Dr. Denise Owens. Dr. Owens is the Heller-Vick Professor of Industrial Psychology and a Distinguished McKnight Professor at the University of Minnesota. She is a Fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and the American Psychological Association. Her research focuses on individual differences, such as personality, cognitive ability, job performance, counterproductive work behaviors, etc., in work settings. She has received numerous prestigious awards for her research on individual differences in employing staffing, and has co-edited the best-selling 2-volume Handbook of Industrial Work and Organizational Psychology, and served as an editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Selection and Assessment and associate editor of the Journal of Personnel Psychology. Dr. Owens serves or has served on editorial boards of a dozen journals in applied and general psychology. Our next panelist is Dr. Paul Spector. Dr. Spector is a distinguished university professor of IO psychology and director of both the IO psychology doctoral program and the interdisciplinary occupational health psychology program at the University of South Florida. Dr. Spector's active research interests presently are counterproductive behavior, violence at work, and cross-cultural job stress. He has published in many of the top journals of the field, and he has authored several books on both methodology and content, including an IO psychology textbook, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Research and Practice. Lastly, we have Dr. David Bequist. He is an associate professor of the management discipline in the HEB School of Business and Administration at the University of the Incarnate Word. He is also the innovator and lead training developer behind the Bloomberg Business Week Edge program. Dr. Bequist has published on collaborative knowledge management, new technologies and training and development, forecasting of business trends, management of technology, information communication technology, consulting trends, medical tourism, and business simulations. He is a well-known speaker and researcher in subjects like training, human resources, medical tourism, and technology trends.
Thank you, Sarah. We will now ask the participants, or the panelists, to present on their topics to illustrate the interesting work that they do as part of their jobs. First, we'll hear from Lillian Eby from the University of Georgia on the topic of mentoring.
Thanks. It's great to be here. This is such a wonderful opportunity to give back to SIOP, and as a mentoring researcher, I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with some of our young people who are interested in the field of IO psychology. As was mentioned before, we typically think of IO as kind of having this industrial side and the organizational side, which have kind of different aims, and my work really is a hybrid of the two because I study a lot of organizational systems and strategies that can help develop employee potential, kind of the I side, but I'm also ultimately real interested in worker well-being and health, which is kind of on the O side. And my interest in mentoring, I think, like a lot of researchers, came about through personal experiences, both my own experiences in the work world and in graduate school as well, and realizing just how important mentoring can be for professional development as well as personal development. And I guess also kind of interestingly, noticing a lot of the experiences of my peers and colleagues that not all mentoring relationships are that great, that some people have really fantastic mentoring relationships, some people have kind of just average or marginal mentoring relationships, and sometimes people can get involved in mentoring relationships that turn out to be quite dysfunctional and harmful for one or both parties. So my work really looks at the full range of mentoring relationships in organizational settings, both relationships that develop informally, just through spontaneous attraction or meeting a senior manager who takes an interest in your career and helps you develop, as well as formal relationships which happen when an organization assigns a protege to a particular mentor as part of a employee initiative such as leadership development or a new employee socialization program or maybe a diversity development program. In terms of how mentoring can add value to organizations and why it's of interest, it's one of these interventions that's actually a pretty low-cost investment for organizations. So rather than designing sophisticated and expensive training program or leadership development programs, mentoring programs can be developed with pretty low cost and pretty low startup. And they also have the advantage of really capitalizing on what is really the competitive advantage in most organizations, which is their human capital or the people that work for them. So it's a great way for organizations to make sure that knowledge gets passed down from workers to younger workers, as well as to reinforce an organizational climate or culture that really values collaboration and values employee development. Mentoring is often thought of as a technique to help the protege or the younger person in the relationship, but actually a lot of work that I've done and that others have done in the field have identified that mentors really stand to gain a lot from these relationships as well. So we really think of mentoring as a mutually beneficial arrangement where both the protege can develop in terms of getting access to high-level managers within the organization, getting challenging assignments, getting exposed to people who could be beneficial in terms of their career development, getting advice and counsel from a more senior person. But the mentor can benefit, too, in terms of gaining a sense of generativity or feeling like they're passing on their knowledge to other people, feeling a sense of self-satisfaction and helping someone grow and develop, maybe even enhancing their own job performance by having someone who can help them with tasks and things that are going on in their work environment. So mentoring is a very flexible tool that can be used in a lot of ways to add value to organizations. And it's actually becoming increasingly popular as we struggle through this economic crisis when HR budgets are getting often cut and programs are cut. It has become kind of very popular as a strategy, a low investment strategy to try to help sustain workers' career development. So as was mentioned in my bio, I study mentoring, both the formal and informal aspects of mentoring. I study both the good side of mentoring, which is what I focus mostly on in this talk, but I also have done a lot of systematic work trying to identify what can go wrong in these relationships. They are interpersonal relationships, and if we think about relationships we've been involved in, friendships, supervisor-subordinate relationships, marriages, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, these are usually pretty good, but they can be fraught with problems as well. So I'm very interested in kind of documenting the things that can go wrong, identifying factors that predict whether relationships might go astray, and then ways that organizations can put in place systems and policies and practices to reduce the chances that bad things can happen. And I think I'm just about out of time, so I will turn it back over to our representative from SIOP.
Okay. Thank you, Lillian. That was very interesting. Next, we have Dr. Kevin Kellaway from the University of St. Mary's, and he'll talk to us about his work with safety.
Thank you. Just before I get started, I'm sorry to do this way. I had a computer problem, so I'm telling the organizers I was kicked out of the session. I've come back in, but I now have a different screen, and I don't see any way of getting feedback or seeing the questions. So, but I'm just going to carry on with my my talk while we try to get that sorted out. That's fixed it. Thank you. So I'm here to talk about some of the work I do in safety. I work in several areas, but a lot of my work has to do with safety in the workplace. And in a way, it's where I started out in IO. During my undergraduate, I attended a school that had a very experimental focus, and I spent most of my time doing studies dealing with auto-shaping in American chameleons, so pretty far from the workplace. But between my third and fourth year, I got a summer job at a consulting firm that did occupational health and safety consulting and drug and alcohol consulting around EAP programs. And that's actually what got me interested in IO. So then I came back as I went through grad school. That was always sort of in the back of my head, was that I had some interests in occupational health, occupational safety. Did research in several areas, including unionization. And I remember going to a talk by Mike Gordon, who's one of the leading union researchers, who at one point said, what if we took our research agendas from the collective agreements that unions negotiated? And of course, health and safety is a big aspect of that. So most of my work has focused on some element to health and safety, and in some organizations it's more traditionally safety applications, and many organizations now have a broader interest in sort of developing healthy workplaces, which subsumes both health and safety. So in organizations are interested in issues of safety because of the substantial costs and the liability issues involved. So we have costs in terms of their healthcare costs. And, aside from the sort of moral aspects, you don't want to be hurting people at work. There are some real financial costs in terms of healthcare and compensation costs and a whole variety of costs. And certainly, as we've seen with the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that was associated with the death of 11 workers, you have some real substantial liabilities that can be ongoing for a firm. So they're certainly interested in enhancing safety performance, and of course, as are employees who want to work in safe environments so they don't go home injured or run into safety problems in the workplace. So safety has a big impact on the organization, a substantial effect on most aspects of functioning. And then the question is, well, how do we improve safety in organizations? And in a textbook I wrote on the subject, we argued that there were really three sort of evolutions in the field, and safety began with very technical solutions, the engineering solutions. We put guards on machines and we design machines so that they can't be used in unsafe ways. And then the next phase was more of an administrative phase, sort of almost corresponding to the I element of IO psychology, where we focused on worker training, establishing work rules, and things like that to enhance training. And we're now, I think, entering the third phase, which is a more human-focused phase, where we recognize that just because we tell people to do work in a certain way, or we design it a certain way, that's not necessarily the way the work gets done. So now we're much more concerned about questions of motivation and leadership and safety culture, and that's very much where my work is focused, especially on the role of leaders in developing safe working cultures. So we take this perspective, we base it in Bass and Avolio's transformational leadership theory, where we posit that leaders are, in fact, the people in the organization who set the tone or establish the culture of the organization. And then we've been looking at the effects of various leadership styles, how leaders behave, how they talk about safety, whether they actually match their talk with their actions, and all of those elements of leadership and how they translate then into worker behavior and accidents and injuries in the workplace. So that's been a large part of our work. We've done some training studies, and we have a lot of research going on looking at how leadership translates into safe working behaviors. And then more recently, we're broadening out and actually going back to a very old topic in IO psychology. One of the very first areas of interest was on the role of fatigue in worker safety and in errors, and we're going back and we're looking at sleep patterns and how people's quantity and quality of sleep now relates to their safe working performance. But again, I guess the theme that ties all that together is the focus on reducing accidents, reducing injuries, making workplaces safer places to be. To come back to my original point, I've been now kicked out of the system 2 or 3 times, and I keep coming back into a different screen. So I've now long since lost track of my timing. I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up. The last question we were asked to address was, how does your training in IO Psych help to advance your work? And I think what psychologists bring to the safety movement in organizations especially is a different mindset, where we look at the sort of human element of the system and then try to design things, rearrange things so that in fact safety is an achievable goal for people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very enlightening. Next we have Dr. Denise Owens from the University of Minnesota, and she'll be talking about sustainability in organizations.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the topic of environmental sustainability. This is not a topic that I've been doing work on for the last 20 years. In fact, if you look at my biography and look at the topics that I've studied, it's very clear that this is a topic that I came to in the last 2 or 3 years. Like many people, I became increasingly concerned with environmental sustainability over just the last few years. I've never considered myself an environmentalist or a conservationist in the traditional sense, but I do consider myself a scientist. And from a scientific perspective, it's very clear that human activity in general and economic activity in particular is reached proportions beyond what our planet can support. And regardless of what your viewpoint is on topics such as climate change, water scarcity, pollution, and so forth, the inhabitability of the planet is essential, and sustainability as a goal is a given. Sustainability, just to make it very clear, United Nations has a definition about it. It is living within the regenerative capacity of the biosphere. That's the definition that the United Nations uses. And when I became involved in this area, I asked myself, what can I do to help the world become a better place? And as a citizen of the world, I could, of course, recycle and live in a more energy-efficient manner and so on, or I could function as a scientist and throw everything that I know about my science against this huge, big problem, and that's what I decided to do. Most scientists who concern themselves with sustainability, unfortunately, are scholars in the natural sciences. And most practitioners who concern themselves with sustainability focus heavily on products that humans use, such as, architects worrying about green buildings and so on. However, if you approach this from the viewpoint of where we can have the strongest impact, you will see that people and human behavior is particularly important, especially human behavior at work, where we spend about half of our waking hours. So as an IO psychologist, I saw a chance to contribute to environmental sustainability, given the unique knowledge about people at work that I could bring to the table and my field could bring to the table. So the world has a problem. All of our scientific societies from the natural sciences have reached the conclusion, and I quote from one of them, quote, "The impacts and long-term consequences of these environmental impacts are far-reaching, ultimately catastrophic, and wholly unsustainable," end quote. So business literature and businesses in general are paying attention to this issue. For example, environmental sustainability is receiving increasing attention at the organizational level. If you look at some outlets such as Harvard Business Review, in the last 20 years, they have published over 110 articles on organizational environmental sustainability. Economists are paying attention. There are schemes that are being used around the globe to compare countries and companies. For example, there's an index that Yale puts out called the Sustainability Index, Yale Sustainability Index. But very few of them directly consider human behavior or what is done. What goes into most of these indices is outcomes and final impact of what is going on. And when I look at that, the thing that is very clear as a psychologist is that the ecological crisis is a crisis of maladaptive behavior. Almost 40 years ago, Maloney and Ward stated, the ecological crisis is a crisis of maladaptive behavior. Thus, the problem falls squarely in the domain of psychology, and ultimately the solution lies with the sciences that deal with changing human behavior. Indeed, ecology is uniquely psychology's problem. In this regard, psychology's task is to articulate the problem in terms of individual behavior and thus to develop guidelines for ameliorative programs. So that's why psychology needs to be involved. Now, why does IO need to be uniquely involved? Well, because organizations care about environmental sustainability. Interestingly, we've conducted a bunch of research on this issue. Among the largest 600 or so U.S. organizations, currently more than 80% engage in or report on environmental sustainability efforts. Among the Fortune 500 in particular, the average company engages in 10 distinct efforts. They have initiatives that involve employees trying to become more environmentally sustainable in their behavior behaviors. There's also some empirical evidence that there's shift in emphasis where people are at work are being affected. For example, if you look at the work that is being put out by the National Center for ONEC Development, we see that there's a strong interest in green jobs, green industries, and there are a number of jobs where even though they may not be green jobs, they require enhanced skills to address the needs of environmental sustainability of the economy that is transitioning to becoming more green. For example, their research shows that in the last few years, more than 60 jobs had increased demand because of greening of our economy. Another 60, there are skills added, and over 90 jobs are new and emerging because of the green economy. These clearly represent an opportunity for IO psychologists in terms of recruitment, selection, motivation, and so on. There's a lot of work that needs to be done from a scientific point of view. University professors and researchers need to conduct a lot of work to address scientific questions about IO psychology and what our contributions can be at work. We are a field that's very strong methodologically, and we can be involved in the development of metrics that pertain to environmental sustainability. And there's a lot of applied work in change efforts and for managerial levels and so on that needs to be conducted. Ultimately, this is going to be a Herculean task. The involvement of IO psychologists in environmental sustainability means that we will have the opportunity to shape the fate of not just employees, but for this planet, and not just for now, but in the long term. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much, Denise. It's very inspiring, and it showcases how many opportunities there are for IO psychologists out there in this burgeoning field. Next, we have Dr. Paul Spector from the University of South Florida, and he's going to speak about stress in the workplace.
Well, occupational stress has become one of the major topics within IO psychology. When we talk about stress, we're really talking about negative conditions and events that occur in the workplace, and they have detrimental effects on physical health, psychological well-being, and people's behavior. The sorts of things that are stressful can involve the way work is organized and work tasks. So, for example, one area is organizational constraints. That's when there are things that happen at work that make it hard to do the job. So, for example, an organization undergoes downsizing, and then the survivors have to pick up the slack for the people who aren't there anymore. That can be very, very stressful. There's interpersonal aspects when people get assaulted at work. There's bullying that goes on and other interpersonal conflicts, and those are other stressful work conditions. Now, I got involved in this really in the early late 1970s. When I was in graduate school in the early 1970s, the study of occupational stress was really in its infancy. There was very little research that was done. Most people had never heard of it. Soon after I graduated, I read a book called Work and Well-Being by two British IO psychologists, Peter Warr and Toby Wall. And the book talked about the relationship between how work was organized and experiences at work and people's health and well-being. And I was really inspired by that book to start doing research in the area. And that's research has gone on now ever since, and particularly in the last few years, it's broadened to include many of the different areas of what's now called occupational health psychology, which is becoming a major sub-area within IO psychology. Occupational health psychology involves accidents, as Dr. Kellaway talked about, injuries, musculoskeletal disorders like lower back pain, violence, work family, just a number of different topics, and also stress. Now, my approach to these different topics is to look at them from the perspective of stress, to where stressful job conditions can be something that leads to accidents, leads to injuries, or in other cases, those sorts of experiences can lead themselves to stress on the part of employees. Now, I see myself as a scientist, and for the most part, I'm doing the basic science. The implications of all this work that I do and others do in this area, on the company side, it helps management better understand the health issues that are involved, better understand the sorts of things that might lead people to be ill, that may lead them to misbehave in the workplace, and just really creates an unhealthy working environment that hurts the company. On the employee side, it also focuses on the things that can produce toxic workplaces that make it difficult for workers, that hurts their health, hurts their well-being. And so if you combine them, the study of occupational stress really helps companies and workers at the same time. By helping companies, it helps workers, and by helping workers, it helps companies. As for one of the questions we're asked to answer is how IO provides a good basis for doing this kind of research. And to me, IO really provides the perfect basis. What I was trained in graduate school, two main things was methodology and the particular IO perspective. On the methodological side, most of the research we do in this area is research done in the field settings. And in order to do that kind of research, it's very difficult. It's difficult to get organizations to let you do the research. You have to be very flexible. You have to have a large number of methodologies at your fingertips to be flexible in order to do this kind of work. And so the methodology training is really key to being able to approach occupational stress from a scientific perspective. The other aspect, IO psychologists bring a particular point of view to the study of workers in the workplace. Other areas of psychology certainly understand health and well-being and stress and those sorts of things. But what we have that's unique is understanding how the worker functions within the context of the organization. So we understand the organizational factors that affect workers, and we understand how the worker affects the organization, and we understand the interaction between workers and their organizations. And so those two really provide a very good basis for doing scientific work in this area. And I'll turn it back over.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. Next, we have David Bequist, and he is from the University of the Incarnate Word, and he will be speaking about globalization in healthcare.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining me on this webinar, and thank you for my colleagues for their perspectives on the different areas. I have to tell you, this has just been a wonderful journey, this journey of getting a degree in IO psychology and the career that I've had since. I've been very, very fortunate to have learned about IO psychology in my undergraduate program. I had a former PhD in IO psychology that had worked for Exxon before it was called Exxon. He originally joined him when it was Humboldt. And he had told me about IO psychology, and I was intrigued. Applied to several programs, got into a PhD program at the University of Tulsa, and have been so very fortunate ever since to have had just a fantabulous career. My career has started out after graduate school, having done a couple of internships. I started out with Ernst & Young as a management consultant. And just to give you a sense of the IO psychology degree and its worth out in the real world, I remember the first week that I had joined Ernst & Young as a consultant, the training class that of the other consultants that came in at my same level included colleagues of mine that were a Harvard MBA and then, for example, a law school graduate from SMU. And so I got the sense that there was something about the PhD in IO psychology that had really added some value to my skill sets. And I later went on to have a successful career at Ernst & Young, moved on from there to industry. I ended up joining a subsidiary of HCA, which is the largest healthcare system in the world, multi-billion-dollar employer, was in the human resources function. and had an opportunity to do a lot of work in terms of not only traditional IO psychology skills, for example, in terms of selection and training and OD, but also worked with the technology aspects of the HRIS systems, the benefits, compensation areas. And what I found through those, both the consulting and the industry experience, is that my degree had prepared me and given me sufficient skills to add a lot of value to a lot of different stakeholders. And again, I reflected upon the fact that I was very fortunate. From there, I had an opportunity to leave industry and become a professor, and I ended up moving into the business school of a medium-sized private university here in San Antonio, Texas, and have had a lot of success there in being able to study an area called medical tourism, which is people traveling abroad for healthcare, not only internationally but even domestically. And again, as Dr. Owens pointed out, I approached it from a scientific standpoint. It was an area where there wasn't a lot of empirical quantitative research in the area. It focused on a couple areas that I had touched on in my past careers. With Ernst & Young, we were developing competency models for businesses to help them to understand what was needed in terms of the skill sets of their employees. And part of that was engaged with both technology implementations as well as outsourcing. So I'd had been, particularly during the 90s, was involved in outsourcing operations. And then later, in terms of healthcare, which is in the United States becoming about almost going to be 20% of the GDP by 2020. So it's a large portion of business in the United States. It has a lot of economic impacts in the United States and affects a lot of employers. And so that was another area of interest of mine. So those came together, and basically I ended up starting to do some research, initially kind of dipping my toe in the waters, but later started to do more and more research, and became one of the leading experts in the world in terms of this medical tourism trend, and have been fortunate enough to travel to 5 continents in the last year and a half to speak on medical tourism. So that's kind of been my career in a nutshell. The IO psychology degree allows, as Dr. Spector pointed out, you to, if you need to be an innovator in industry. You can take on new areas. You can address the unknowns. You are truly have a scientific skill set. You have the ability to do research as good as perhaps any other degree that would be given in the world. You have the ability to think critically. You have an understanding of human capital, which is perhaps the most important thing. And it allows you to serve in a variety of different roles, whether that be in consulting or industry, government, academia, as a researcher, as a teacher. So it's a very, very useful degree. I would highly encourage anyone to at least look into it or perhaps pursue it. And lastly, it allows the diversity of those, having all those skill sets kind of bundled into one person. The last thing I'll talk about, I've been very fortunate through my work at the university to be involved in training of MBAs, for example. And as part of my work with MBAs, I got involved with Bloomberg Businessweek, the major business publication. And through some of my training from graduate school, some of the things that I learned from industry, was able to develop in coordination with them a training program, which is used at organizations like AT&T and Intel and GE and Standard & Poor's. And this training program system basically uses the Businessweek magazine. And again, those opportunities wouldn't have been around for me. There probably wouldn't have been as many opportunities available for me without that PhD in IO psychology. So whether you're pursuing a master's or PhD, I think it's very valuable, and I would love to welcome you into this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. The participants from listening to all of them speak about their areas of expertise and research, can see how IO is such a diverse field and how many different ways IO contributes to organizational success. We'll now go to the questions that are being sent in via chat from the participants. The panelists will now take turns reading these questions aloud and then answering the questions that have been assigned to them. So we encourage participants to submit questions via the chat box on the screen. As a reminder, the chat is located on the left-hand side of your screen. To submit a question, type your question into the small box at the bottom and then hit the send button. But please note that due to time constraints, our panel may not respond to all the questions that are submitted. So we'll start off with Dr. Eby.
Thanks. Well, there's a question here that was posed by a panelist that asks, what are some important factors to consider when choosing a master's degree program in IO? And I think this is actually a really good question and something that comes up a lot when I talk with undergrads about whether they should go to a master's program or whether they should go directly into a PhD program and get a master's along the way. And I expect that the other members of the panel may have different opinions on this, so this might be a question that we want to get another perspective on. But I did a master's myself first before getting a PhD, and I think that was actually a really good experience for me because it helped me realize that I really wanted to go on and devote the additional time and energy and the academic side of things to obtain a PhD. So I think the main consideration in deciding about a master's program in general is how committed you are to doing 4 to 6 years of a PhD. And so I think there's a lot of benefit if you're unsure to doing a master's first and getting a lot of the more practical kinds of coursework as well as practical internship experience with the master's. With that said, important factors, I think probably the most important factor is fit, what I would call fit. So I would just strongly encourage students to try, if they possibly can, to visit the programs. Lots of programs have visitation days for master's or PhD programs. Look carefully at the faculty members that are listed on the website and see if you find a faculty member that has an interest that's similar to yours. Ask about whether you will be assigned a faculty member or whether you will just kind of make your way to finding a faculty member along the way. And so I really think the content and curriculum is probably going to be very similar across master's programs. I think really issues of interpersonal fit with faculty as well as student climate are probably the most important factors.
Great, thank you. Next, Dr. Kellaway, do you have any questions that were addressed to you?
Okay, yes, I guess I have the same question is showing up on my screen. What are some important factors to consider when choosing a master's degree program in IO? And certainly I agree with Lillian that the climate of the program, fit with faculty members, is incredibly important. I've taught in a couple of master's programs and in fact did a terminal master's and then years later came back to do a PhD. I've always found one of the most valuable aspects, and it's not standard in Canada, so I'm not sure if it is in the States or not, but I think programs that offer practicum or internship experience add a lot. Most of the programs, at least in Canada, are fairly similar in terms of academic content, what gets taught in the courses, but a real distinguisher would be whether the program builds in an opportunity for applied experience as well. So that would be something I'd look for in a program. Thanks.
And Dr. Owens?
Yes, I have a question here. Let me state the question. It says, I'm 44 and have been part of corporate America for 20 years. I'm not considering a PhD in IO psychology delivered in an online format. First, does it make sense to enter the field mid-career, and does it make sense to pursue an online option, i.e., will it be as valued as an on-site program would be? Let me take the two parts of the question, I guess, separately. The first piece is does it make sense to enter the field mid-career? And absolutely is sort of my viewpoint on that. I've had many PhD students who have entered the field in their 40s and even a couple in their 50s that have had very successful runs through the PhD program and have gone on to successful careers. I will also give you an example of a colleague of mine who became one of the topmost published scholars, a woman in the field who got her PhD in her early 40s and is the topmost published woman in our field today, Dr. Joyce Bono. So it is absolutely not too late to come to IO psychology mid-career or in your 40s or in your 50s. The second part of the question is about whether or not an online option is as good as an on-site program. And I have not looked into online options, and I know there are a number of them out there. The question to ask is, what are the unique benefits of online, and contrast them with the unique benefits of on-site. And the couple of things that might be, perhaps some of the other panelists could chime in on this issue, things like mentoring and getting help with research methods and learning from individual scholars whose interests match you might be an issue on an online program. But again, I haven't looked that much into online programs.
Thank you. I just want to remind the participants who are listening, they're free to submit as many questions as they're interested in submitting. We have a lot of collective talent here. You know, ask the questions that you have always been wanting to ask, or questions that have been jogged by things that you've heard today. Next, we'll have Paul Spector answer a question.
Okay, Brenda asks how committed does she need to be to one research area to apply for grad school, and is there room to change specializations during grad school? Most doctoral programs are looking for a student who has research experience in their background as an undergraduate. So often the main thing is that you have some research experience. Sometimes students have research experience related to IO. Sometimes they have research experiences in other areas. Generally, I don't think many people expect that as an undergrad you're going to be able to figure out what you're going to want to study for the rest of your career. And there's plenty of room once you get to graduate school to explore interests and move around to different areas. And I see many of our graduate students start off in one area and then might work in 2 or 3 areas. Some do stick to a single area of interest, but there's lots of room to move around. The only caveat I would say is that if you're contemplating having an academic career and becoming a professor, it's good to, in graduate school, carve out at least one area of sort of central interest that you do several studies in and do a bit of work in, so it looks like you really have one particular interest and you're not just dabbling in too many different things. But there's still plenty of room to explore, especially early on.
Great. Next, we'll have Dr. Wiquist answer a question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carl. The question I have is, what do you wish that you could make companies or workers understand or do in terms of your work, and what are the challenges in making this happen? One of the interesting aspects of the research that I'm currently involved in, medical travel, or medical tourism as it's called, is that you're seeing large employers, particularly in the United States, that are contemplating or actually putting in place programs of bundled payments. We've seen it with Lowe's. We've seen it recently with Pepsi and Boeing, where they're choosing centers of excellence, healthcare centers of excellence that are known to have better outcomes and higher quality care than a traditional facility in your local geographic area. And those centers of excellence the companies are going to them and bundling contracts and getting reduced rates for healthcare. Healthcare expenses, if you're not familiar, are one of the most cumbersome expenses, costs that employers are bearing right now regarding their human capital. So what I'm doing is working with both government stakeholders, people in industry, as well as consulting firms that are wanting to develop programs on this to help employers to be able to find ways in which to not only utilize and access quality health care, but also to reduce their costs. And the cost savings are fairly significant on extremely complex invasive procedures. It can be upward 30 to 40% savings just traveling domestically for healthcare, even including the travel. So what I find is that because of my background in IO psychology and because of my orientation as a scientist and having a bias towards empiricism and methodologies, scientific methodologies, that sometimes the research has to come before the action does. The employers are not willing to commit into new or leading-edge innovative methodologies and systems before there's data in place. So that's kind of the purpose I serve, and that's the purpose I think a lot of IO psychologists serve, whether you hear from the panelists who told you about the different areas that they're working in where they would like to see employers start to use these best practice systems and models, but the empiricism, the quantitative data has to come first. So that's kind of what I find in my field. Thank you.
Okay. It seems as though we're getting close to our time running out. We have some time for a few more questions. Do any of our panelists have a question they particularly would like to answer? Go ahead and speak up.
I have one from Dolan Allen. It says, how does IO psychology integrate the skills of counseling to better relate to human capital on a personal level? It's not especially an area that I'm specialized in, but what I do know is that having an understanding of human capital and particularly human behavior, which came not only in my undergraduate but also later in my graduate degree, has helped greatly in my career in both consulting, in industry, and in academia, and particularly in regards to teaching. So again, I think the IO psychology degree is just so valuable in all those areas.
Great. Anyone else?
I have a question. The question says, do organizations seem to have an inherent interest in sustainability and research, or does it seem to be more about the bottom line? Particularly going to the topic of environmental sustainability that I was talking about. There are data on this. The concept of triple bottom line has been with us for several years now, and organizations, and it's not just a lip service, the triple bottom line pertaining to the social, environmental, and economic aspects of business and its mission. And I see this as becoming core to the extent that the top management of most companies are genuinely committed to the triple bottom line. And the research that we've done with the Fortune 500 seems to back it up. In fact, when we looked at the strategies and the goals of organizations, the realization is that if there is no land to support the growth of crops, and there is no water to help make the products in about 50 years, and there is no proper energy to be able to run the machineries and the factories and so on, the long-term sustainability of their business is at stake. So the issue is no longer the relationship between, does it help my bottom line today? The question is, does it help my bottom line in the long term? And in the long term, environmental sustainability and economic sustainability are well aligned.
Thank you. Okay, it appears our time's running out, and we're going to have to bring our webinar to a close. I'd like to mention that there's more information available to students about industrial organizational psychology on the web at SIOP.org. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today and to share their interesting work with our participants. So, on behalf of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, I'd like to thank you for your participation in today's event. A post-event survey will appear requesting your feedback. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as it will help SIOP to plan future web events. This concludes today's program. We sincerely hope that this webinar has helped the audience to increase their interest in and knowledge of industrial organizational psychology. Again, please fill out our survey. Thank you, and have a great day.